Welcome to the Quark and Roll podcast. I am your host, Quark Van. Today's guest is Dr. Judith Plaskow, a pioneer in Jewish feminist theology. In this episode, we will talk about the war in Iran, the conflicts in the Middle East and Palestinian issues, as well as the development of Jewish feminist theology. Judith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Prilan. It's a pleasure to be here, to see you.
Thank you. I would like to ask you, what are some of your reflections about the war in Iran? The war has entered into the fourth week.
I'm appalled by it. I don't know that I have anything to say that many other people haven't said more eloquently. It seems like a pointless war. Why now? The president seems to have no overall vision of what he's trying to achieve or how he's going to end it. It's a tragic loss of human life. And he's spending $1 billion a day that could be addressing crucial domestic issues. People are having their food stamp benefits cut. Education is being cut back. Our healthcare is in shambles. He's ending research in many crucial areas. All these issues could be funded through the billions of dollars being spent on a pointless war. It's horrific.
While the war is going on, we shouldn't lose sight of the situation in the wider Middle Eastern areas, especially the conflicts between Israel and Palestinians. I know that you have also been quite outspoken on issues regarding this Middle Eastern conflict. Can you share with us your views?
I think that the war in Gaza is appalling. The destruction of the Strip, of buildings, of hospitals, the deaths of tens of thousands of people is appalling and unconscionable. And while all that is going on, Israel is also committing violence against Palestinians on the West Bank. And while the focus of the international community is on Gaza, more and more villages in the West Bank are being destroyed and people rendered homeless. So it's a terrible situation. It feels like the whole world is on fire.
I also want to tell you, you are one of the first that brought to my attention anti-Judaism in feminist scholarship in Christian circles. And certainly we have learned so much from you. Today, anti-Semitism has been sometimes weaponized. I am a graduate of Harvard, and Harvard now may need to pay $1 billion just to settle the accusation that Harvard has not done enough to handle the question of anti-Semitism. When you look back, the issue is so complicated now, isn't it, than what you have said decades ago.
Yeah, it's immensely complicated, and it's clear that this administration is weaponizing accusations of anti-Semitism in order to destroy American universities. And unfortunately, there are segments of the Jewish community that are feeding into that by crying anti-Semitism, equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitic, but it certainly isn't always. Criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic. So I think it's a real struggle in the Jewish community right now. And at the same time, real anti-Semitism is rising. So how do you disentangle the weaponization of anti-Semitism from the reality that all kinds of hate are rising in the culture encouraged by the administration? It's a really complicated issue. I was writing about anti-Judaism in my work, not anti-Semitism. So I was really looking at the way in which Christian scholars were using traditional anti-Jewish religious tropes in their work And I wasn't really addressing the larger issue of anti-Semitism that we see now in our culture. One of the questions that I'm asking myself is, what's the relationship between those two things? And there's no question that the anti-Jewish strands in the Christian tradition make available a whole lot of ideas and images that can be used by anti-Semites. And at the same time, not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. So how do you tease out that complexity?
I think both Jewish and Christian believers need to rethink about their own identities. I have a friend, Dr. Atalia Omar, who used your trope, standing again at Sinai, when she was talking about solidarity with Palestinians. That is, the war in Gaza really prompted her to think about standing at Sinai again, to think about Jewish history and identity. You being a pioneer in so many discourse regarding Jewish identity, Jewish feminism. Regarding Jewish identity, have you been thinking something new in these several years?
Yeah, I certainly have. When I was a young girl, around 12, I was obsessed with the Holocaust. And the question that I had was it an accident of history that Jews were the victims? What would happen if Jews had power? And in the last many years, and certainly since October 7th, the question of how are Jews exercising power and how are we doing to other people all the things that we had hated when they were done to us. I think a lot of progressive Jews are really struggling. You know, what we've claimed are Jewish values are so totally antithetical to what's happening in Israel right now. The problem is that Israel claims to speak for us. It doesn't speak for us, but it claims to. And what does it mean to live in a world in which a country that claims to be speaking and acting on behalf of all Jews is doing these horrendous things? It creates a real shakeup in Jewish identity. It's hard not to feel that at the moment. Who are we as a people? And we're about to celebrate Passover just this coming Wednesday. And that's the holiday on which we celebrate the liberation from Egypt. And what does it mean to be celebrating our liberation right now at this moment, when what's happening in Israel is so unspeakable? That's really the question we're going to be grappling with at our Seder this year.
And at this time, some may think that feminist theologians need to address these burning issues. And you have been a pioneer in Jewish feminist theology. Can you share with us, how did you begin thinking about this?
I became a feminist in the fall of 1969 when Yale admitted women to the undergraduate college and made a big splash. It was on the front page of the New York Times. And a group of graduate women got together to ask how it was that we had been at Yale for 80 years and apparently nobody had noticed. So we began meeting weekly for consciousness raising and activism. And I was a graduate student in religious studies. So it made sense that I would bring the feminist questions I was raising to my studies. Now, I was being trained in Protestant theology. My dissertation was a feminist critique of Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich's doctrines of sin and grace. It was the second feminist dissertation in religious studies after Rita Gross's. And I found myself at that point a number of times on the list of Protestant feminist theologians, and it felt very strange. I was essentially writing Protestant theology, but it made no sense because I was a Jew, and yet I wasn't trained in Jewish studies. But in the summer of 1980, I had the opportunity to teach a course on Jewish feminist theology at a Jewish summer institute that had a variety of courses, including 3 on feminist issues. And that course was really a life-changing experience for me. It was an extraordinary opportunity to talk about Jewish feminist issues with a group of other Jewish feminists. And I went home at the end of the week of the Institute and wrote The Right Question is Theological. That was my first writing on Jewish feminism, in which I called for the rethinking of Torah, God, and Israel from a feminist perspective. So at the point that I wrote the article, I had no idea whatsoever how to do that, but it was clear to me that it needed to be done. And that was really getting my feet wet, and more than getting my feet wet, talking about Jewish feminist theology. And then from there, over the course of the next decade, I began to think and speak and lecture on what would it mean to rethink Judaism from a feminist perspective.
When you began, were there many women supporting what you are doing among the Jewish community, or they think, no, the question is not theological? Who were the dialogical partners?
That essay, the title, The Right Question is Theological, was a response to a very important essay that Cynthia Ozick had written in Lilith magazine in 1979 called Notes Towards Finding the Right Question, in which she argued that the question of women's role in Judaism is fundamentally a sociological and not a theological question. I framed my article as, in part, a response to her. So I would say there were certainly many Jewish feminists who were interested and excited by what I was doing. There were not other Jewish feminist theologians, and there still are very few. I was told when I started graduate school and talked to Judah Golden, who was the Jewish studies professor at Yale at the time, about Jewish theology. He said, there's no such thing as Jewish theology. There are no Jewish theologians. And I hoped when I began doing Jewish feminist theology that it would lead to a broader revival of theological discourse. It hasn't really happened. That's not where the primary energy of Jewish feminism is. At the same time, my work has had a very great impact and has been very well received. It's not like people were opposed to theology, but they weren't interested in doing it themselves. Jewish feminism, I think, has contributed far more in terms of ritual, for example. That's been an area of tremendous interest and creativity, biblical commentary in many modes, but not so much theology.
Why is that so? Is that because of lack of training, or the feminists want to emphasize more on practice?
I think that Judaism as a tradition has been more interested in practice than belief. That's the standard answer to the question, that Judaism is a religion of practice. And the way in which Jewish theology has been done historically is as much through midrash, biblical commentary, as through formal systematic theology. I think that most Jews see systematic theology as a Christian enterprise.
That may be so.
Yeah, it's that belief is expressed through storytelling, through midrash, more than through, as I said, systemic theology.
And if you were to advise younger Jewish feminist theologians who wants to follow your step, what are some of the current issues they should be wrestling with?
For the last 6 years, actually, I've had a very exciting study partnership with Mara Benjamin, who's a Jewish feminist theologian of the next generation. She has just drafted a book on the challenge of climate change to Jewish thought, and we've been reading together for the last 6 years as she's been working on that project. I see that as very exciting, as bringing the insights and the critical tools of feminist theology to broader social issues. And in fact, when I started writing Standing In at Sinai, I asked myself, did I want to write a book on the feminist transformation of Judaism, or did I want to write a liberation theology from a Jewish feminist perspective? And I decided to write the former because I knew how to do it and I wasn't sure how to do the other. But I feel like this project with Mara has really opened me up to seeing how it is that you take the tools that we've developed over decades now and begin to address issues of deep concern. And I think that's a very exciting direction for Jewish feminist theology.
And you have co-founded the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion with Elizabeth Ferenza. Can you tell us the story behind that?
Elizabeth and I met at the Conference of Women Exploring Theology at Grailville in 1972, which was a very exciting event, bringing together Protestant and Catholic women, mostly people in various forms of ministry, but a number of academics. I was the only Jew there. And Elizabeth was a pretty new immigrant from Germany at that point, but we became friends from the time of that conference. We were among a fairly small number of academics there. And at that time, it was very difficult to get the Journal of the American Academy of Religion or the Journal of the Society of Biblical Literature, the Harvard Theological Review. They were not accepting much material by women, and certainly not feminist articles in religious studies. And then there were the two terrific women's studies journals, Feminist Studies and Signs, but they weren't interested in religion because they saw religion as inherently conservative. I think that's continued to be a problem for us in the field, that women's studies people don't really take religious studies seriously. So Elizabeth and I felt there needed to be a journal in feminist studies and religion. And we were fantasizing about that for a decade after we met. And then I can't remember, it was 82 or 83. We were at an AAR reception with Conrad Cherry, who was the director of Scholars Press at that point. And we went up to him at the reception and we said, we had this idea. Would you be interested? And he said, yes, he would. And basically, the press would publish the journal and do the mailing, but we had complete editorial control for good and for ill. It meant there was no copy editor, there was no help, but they were willing to publish it. And we put a small amount of money into the first issue, and it sustained itself. And Indiana took it over probably after about 15 years. And it sustained itself for the last 40 plus years.
It's amazing, isn't it? When you started, you might not have expected it has now grown to be a premier journal in the field.
I know.
And watching the development of scholarship in feminist studies in religion over the decades, have you seen some changes at all?
I think there have been a lot of changes. One of the things that's very striking, I think for the first 10 years, there was not a single article on Islam. And now there's a lot of material on Islam, articles, conversations, roundtables. That's very exciting. I think that Elizabeth and I were working very hard at not making it just a Christian journal. This has been a challenge from the beginning. I think that there has been more material over the years from a range of traditions. There's been more and more focus on violence against women in a range of traditional texts. So the connection between traditional texts and violence in the larger culture. There's been more on teaching. There have been editorials. So the journal has really diversified in terms of the kinds of things that it's publishing. Oh, one initiative that I think started, maybe it's 20 years now. It's hard to believe it's that long, was the Across Generations conversations between younger scholars and senior scholars in the field. And I'm very aware of how many people in my generation have died or are ill, and it feels really important to hear about people's scholarship while they can still talk about it. So I think that's been a really exciting and important initiative of the journal.
Yes, I benefit from those conversations so that the next generation will not need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Judith, you have written a very important essay talking about racism in feminist scholarship and related also to the journal too. Can you share some of your observations?
At the time of the murder of George Floyd, when there was a lot of self-examination and questioning on the part of many institutions, and institutions were offering flowery words about racism, the editors of the JFSR decided that we needed to look seriously and formulate some real initiatives in relation to the JFSR around racism. I took that as an opportunity to look back at the history of the JFSR. I went through every issue, actually looking at who was on the editorial board when, and looking at the kinds of materials we were publishing and to what extent we were looking at racism as an issue at different moments in the JFSR. What's really quite striking is that from the beginning, we had women of color on the editorial board, and the percentage of women of color grew steadily through the years. I think it's now a third or maybe 40%, but the number of Black women remained relatively small throughout. So it was really quite striking when I stepped back and looked at it. And, I was just trying to explore what is that about? How do we understand that? Elizabeth and I needed to think more clearly and explicitly about how to be nurturing the next generations of editors. And I was trying to think about our successes and failures in that realm and just try to name some of the dynamics that kept the JFSR in some ways a white institution. So I wrote a substantial piece on this, and a number of people responded to it. And Emily Town said, it is a white institution. And she was saying that just is the reality. It's part of the systemic racism of the culture. And for me, as a Jew, that was really interesting because here I was a Jewish co-editor of the JFSR from the beginning, and yet I felt it's always been, in some sense, a Christian journal. How is that? Why is that? Why is my presence not enough to change that? And Emily, I think, was pointing me to the larger systemic structures in which we're living. And so in the article, I talk a lot about my experiences as a Jew trying to make it a genuinely multi-religious journal and the headwinds against that, and similar headwinds against making it a journal that felt totally inclusive of all kinds of women. And
yes, I think that reflects the larger culture and how it shapes the academy. For example, you and I belongs to the American Academy of the Religion, and the majority of those program units, they are Christian-centered. And you have many more Christian theologians, biblical scholars than people who study other religious faiths in the United States. And that is why it influenced the kind of scholarships we produce. And then talking about the international connections, sometimes we also have hard time, number one, recruiting international authors. Number two, when we evaluate their work, sometimes you use so-called very Western standards. So we said this is not academically rigorous. So again, you have so many layers, isn't it?
Yeah, we've talked about this so many times as an editorial board because we're getting more and more articles from women in many different countries, and sometimes they don't have access to the scholarship through their institutions. Sometimes we're just bringing, as you say, Western standards to pieces that we ought to be publishing. We've really struggled with that. I would say that's another way in which the JFSR has changed. I think we always played an important role in mentoring young scholars, that we sent out articles for anonymous review, and we took the review process seriously and tried to give people substantial feedback, for which many people were very grateful. And in the last few years, we've been asking, how do we mentor young scholars? If we receive a piece that has promise, but the person clearly doesn't have access to the latest scholarship, how do we make that possible? How do we engage in conversation beyond the rejection of the piece?
I know that you also participate in protests and participate in activism. Can you share what have you been involved lately, if anything?
For the last 6 or 7 years, I was quite involved in an organization, the Alliance of Families for Justice, that works with the families of incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people, empowering and mobilizing them. And that was such interesting, rewarding work. It was the first time that I was really very involved in a Black-led organization and learned to follow the lead of people who were most impacted. And then, unfortunately, the executive director retired and the organization has fragmented. So in a way, I've been trying to figure out what's next. I've also been involved in an organization called Haven that hosts and escorts women having abortions in New York. And I just became the volunteer coordinator for that. So I'm still very involved in that. And I'm going to protests and calling my congresspeople and trying to figure out what to do at this moment. I have to say that talking about Jewish identity, this is a moment that's made me see ordinary Germans who I saw as horrible and different bystanders in a different way, because I realize here we are, caught up in this horrific situation with American democracy being dismantled, and we're trying to figure out what can we do? How do we stop this? It's not clear.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today and joining the podcast.
Thank you, Pulan. I enjoyed speaking with you.
If you enjoy the podcast, Please subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next episode.